Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section of the Vision and The Riddle in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I also have a discussion of the films 127 Hours and A Theory of Everything to accompany the section. So let's get started. Of the Vision and the Riddle. Part 1. When it became rumoured among the sailors that Zarathustra was on the ship, for a man from the blissful islands had gone on board at the same time as he, a great curiosity and expectancy arose. But Zarathustra was silent for 2 days, and was cold and deaf for sorrow, so that he responded neither to looks nor to questions. But on the evening of the second day he opened his ears again, although he still remained silent, for there were many strange and dangerous things to hear on this ship, which had come from afar, and had yet further to go. Zarathustra, however, was a friend to all who take long journeys, and do not want to live without danger. And behold, in listening his tongue was loosened, and the ice of his heart broke. Then he started to speak thus: To you, the bold venturers and adventurers, and whoever has embarked with cunning sails upon dreadful seas, to you who are intoxicated by riddles, who take pleasure in twilight, whose soul is lured with flutes to every treacherous abyss, for you do not desire to feel for a rope with cowardly hand, and where you can guess, you hate to calculate. To you alone do I tell this riddle that I saw, the vision of the most solitary man. Lately I walked gloomily through a deathly grey twilight, gloomily and sternly with compressed lips. Not only one sun had gone down for me, a path that mounted defiantly through boulders and rubble, a wicked solitary path that bush or plant no longer cheered, a mountain path crunched under my foot's defiance, striding mute over the mocking clatter of pebbles, trampling the stones that made it slip. Thus my foot with effort forced itself upward, despite the spirit that drew it downward, drew it towards the abyss, the spirit of gravity, my devil and arch enemy. Upward, although he sat upon me, half dwarf, half mole, crippled, crippling, pouring lead drops into my ear, leaden thoughts into my brain. O Zarathustra, he said mockingly, syllable by syllable, you stone of wisdom, you have thrown yourself high, but every stone that is thrown must fall. O Zarathustra, you stone of wisdom, you projectile, you star destroyer, you have thrown yourself thus high, but every stone that is thrown must fall. Condemned by yourself and to your own stone throwing, O Zarathustra, far indeed you have thrown your stone, but it will fall back upon you. Thereupon the dwarf fell silent, and he long continued so. But his silence oppressed me, and to be thus in company is truly more lonely than to be alone. I climbed, I dreamed, I thought, but everything oppressed me. I was like a sick man, wearied by his sore torment, and reawakened from sleep by a worse dream. But there is something in me that I call courage. It has always destroyed every discouragement in me. This courage at last bade me stop and say, Dwarf, you or I. For courage is the best destroyer, courage that attacks, for in every attack there is a triumphant shout. Man, however, is the most courageous animal. With his courage he has overcome every animal. With a triumphant shout he has overcome every pain. Human pain, however, is the deepest pain. Courage also destroys giddiness and abysses. And where does man not stand at an abyss? Is seeing itself not seeing abysses? Courage is the best destroyer. Courage also destroys pity. Pity, however, is the deepest abyss. As deeply as man looks into life, so deeply does he look also into suffering. Courage, however, is the best destroyer. Courage that attacks, it destroys even death. For it says, was that life? Well then, once more. But there is a great triumphant shout in such a saying. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So kicking off the section, then we have Zarathustra sitting on the boat as he does, with the sailors sat around him, and then he's stirred up all of a sudden by wanting to speak to everyone who specifically want to go on journeys but don't want to live without any danger, as it says. So basically wants a nice peaceful journey without any bumps in the road. You get from point A to point B without any hiccups whatsoever. And of course, if anybody goes on any journeys whatsoever, be it in a car, in a train, in a plane, you don't want anything to disrupt the journey at all. And then we have the moment in which Zarathustra starts to walk on a path and starts to make his way upward as he does. And then we have this dwarf quite strangely pour lead drops into his ears as he does, mocking him as he goes. And then he gets quite annoyed with this dwarf. And then we have that fantastic point about courage at the end of it. So, starting off on the section, we could say, well, what is this whole point? It's to say, well, life is never without its bumps and hiccups. And this whole point about moving upward and this whole thing about the dwarf is really to say, well, you have to make a whole move yourself and have that perseverance and desire within yourself to continue on within whatever it is of life's journey. And what's going to happen is things are going to go wrong at given points, and those things are going to try to weigh you down. And so we have that specifically moment where the weighing down is the dripping the lead into his ears. They're trying to hold you back in a given way. And then we have that next moment where he is feeling quite sad for himself. But then he has that fantastic point as well. Well, man is the most courageous animal. And that absolutely fantastic line, courage is the best destroyer, courage that attacks, it destroys even death. For it says, was that life? Well then, once more. And so it's really to say, well, things are going to try to hold you back in life. We're going to need the courage and willpower ultimately within us to overcome all this. And it's going to be our courage that are going to be the conquerors, are going to be the things that enable us to continue on our journey. And it's such a fantastic example as we can think as well about the ways in which life can throw speed bumps in the way. And then we have to find courage within us to continue on. And one of those is when anybody has the rather unfortunate experience of having a cancer diagnosis. And therefore, that's one of the ultimate speed bumps, of course, they put in the path of anybody's life journey, as they say. But then it also gets into the whole point about the section as well, that it's a horrible thing, but ultimately it's our willpower within us, it's our whole courage and determination and will to life, ultimately, our whole wanting to live and kick cancers, but that we show precisely how courageous we are as a species. And so continuing on with the second part of this section. Stop, dwarf, I said. I or you? But I am the stronger of us two. You do not know my abysmal thought. That thought you could not endure. Then something occurred which lightened me. For the dwarf jumped from my shoulder, the inquisitive dwarf, and he squatted down upon a stone in front of me. But a gateway stood just where we had halted. Behold this gateway, dwarf, I went on. It has two aspects. Two paths come together here. No one has ever reached their end. This long lane behind us, it goes on for an eternity. And that long lane ahead of us, that is another eternity. They are in opposition to one another, these paths. They about on one another. And it is here, at this gateway, that they come together. The name of the gateway is written above it, moment. But if one were to follow them further, and ever further, and further, do you think, dwarf, that these paths would be in eternal opposition? Everything straight lies, murmured the dwarf disdainfully. All truth is crooked, time itself is a circle. Spirit of gravity, I said angrily, do not treat this too lightly, or I shall leave you squatting where you are, lame foot, and I have carried you high. Behold this moment, I went on. From this gateway, moment, a long eternal lane runs back, and eternity lies behind us. Must not all things that can run have already run along this lane? Must not all things that can run have already run along this lane? Must not all things that can happen have already happened, been done, run past? And if all things have been here before, what do you think of this moment, dwarf? Must not this gateway too have been here before? And are not all things bound fast together in such a way that this moment draws after all future things, therefore draws itself too? For all things that can run must also run once again forward along this long lane. And this slow spider that creeps along in the moonlight, and this moonlight itself, and I and you at this gate, whispering together, whispering of eternal things, must we not all have been here before? And must we not return and run down the other lane out before us, down that long, terrible lane? Must we not return eternally? Thus I spoke, and I spoke more and more softly, for I was afraid of my own thoughts and reservations. Then suddenly I heard a dog howling nearby. Had I ever heard a dog howling in that way? My thoughts ran back. Yes, when I was a child, in my most distant childhood, then I had heard a dog howling in that way, and I saw it too, bristling, its head raised, trembling in the stillest midnight, when even dogs believe in ghosts. So that it moved me to pity, for the full moon had just gone over the house, silent as death. It had just stopped still, a round glow still upon the flat roof, as if upon a forbidden place. That was what had terrified the dog, for dogs believe in thieves and ghosts, and when I heard such howling again, it moved me to pity again. Where had the dwarf now gone, and the gateway, and the spider, and all the whispering? Had I been dreaming? Had I awoken? All at once I was standing between wild cliffs, alone, desolate in the most desolate moonlight. But there a man was lying, and there the dog, leaping, bristling, whining. Then it saw me coming. Then it howled again. Then it cried out. Had I ever heard a dog cry so for help? So then in part 2 of this section, we have opening a discussion about the philosophy of time and the way in which time is cyclical. And this follows on from Nietzsche's concept and idea of how time works. And his concept of how time works is the eternal return. And so, how we think of time is very much on a straight line. As we have Zarathustra and the dwarf at this lane, everything's behind them, and then they have this path going in front. And it's that fantastic moment where they're standing in this path, this forward and back, because that's how we think of time, past, present, future, and very much this sort of linear path structure. But then we have Zarathustra start to pick away at this to say, well, do you always think it's going to be like this? Because we have the whole aspect of, well, the past has an influence upon the present. And we can say that in the sense of, well, past events, and it could be from the very novel and minor to traumatic events and thoughts and various different things that we have, all have an effect upon us in the here and now. And then also we have that relation into the future to say, well, do you think it's always going to be like this? To say, well, we like to think we have a semblance of control over given situations, and we have a semblance of power, let's say, to know what's going to happen in the future. And it removes all that anxiety as well. And a good example of that's when you go on to travel to a destination, you go and find out all the information about it and have a look at maps and so forth. You try to remove all that anxiety. But it's that whole point, and it goes back into the aspect on part one as well. Life's journey, even though you can try to plan for things, things are going to still be in a very much a speed bump sort of way. You're going to hit bumps in the road in the future, and you can't have complete control over what's going to happen. Because there's also this whole idea within Nietzsche as well of the acceptance of fate. Because we have no really control over our own life in a given way, what is the thing that's in control of us is ultimately the world and all the little things that can happen to us on a daily basis. Those are the things that ultimately affect us in a very big way. And therefore, we have this sort of cyclical process within Nietzsche of how we think of time as events as continually reoccurring as they replay back to us. And then also, when we think of the future, of how we then are going to interact with these occurrences as a return. Is it always going to be the same? No, it's going to be a different way each time. It's going to return differently each time because it's going to be a different reason for why we think of a given thing coming back to us and affecting us a given specific time period. And so all this nicely fits then into an autobiographical example within Nietzsche's own life here, when he deals with his own father's death. And we have this fantastic note at the back of the book as well here that explains exactly this whole relationship with the dog example that's popped up. So I'll read this little note that's at the back because it's really quite interesting. This scene is a memory from Nietzsche's childhood. Nietzsche's father died following a fall, and it seems that Nietzsche was attracted to the scene by the frightened barking of a dog. He found his father lying unconscious. It's not entirely clear why the scene should have been evoked at this point. The most likely suggestion is that Nietzsche at one time thought that events reoccurred within historical time and was troubled by the idea that he might meet the same death as his father. The idea seems to have assumed the nature of an obsession. Its origin probably lay in Nietzsche's fear of madness, which was strengthened by the fact that his father died insane. The insanity was caused by the fall, but Nietzsche was probably doubtful whether the fall did not merely bring to the surface an inherited weakness. This old idea may have come into the author's mind at this point and have been included in the text as a cryptic history of the theory of the eternal reoccurrence. What follows is, of course, symbolic and not actual. So then we have that whole idea there from Nietzsche's own childhood and his own trauma replaying within his own mind as it's coming out in the story here. And it's that whole point as well. When anybody has anything traumatic happen to them or experience to it, it's going to replay within somebody's own mind at a given point, and it's going to return each given time. But ultimately, we're going to have to be courageous each given time in order to overcome it, so it doesn't burden us down and weigh us down any. And this follows into the last little part that rounds off the section. So, continuing on into the last little bit. And truly, I had never seen the like of what I then saw. I saw a young shepherd writhing, choking, convulsed, his face distorted, and a heavy black snake was hanging out of his mouth. Had I ever seen so much disgust and pallid horror on a face? Had he perhaps been asleep? Then the snake had crawled into his throat, and there had bitten itself fast. My hands tugged and tugged at the snake in vain. They could not tug the snake out of the shepherd's throat. Then a voice cried from me, "Bite! Bite! Its head off! Bite!" Thus a voice cried from me. My horror, my hate, my disgust, my pity, all my good and evil cried out of me with a single cry. You bold men around me, you venturers, adventurers, and those of you who have embarked with cunning sails upon undiscovered seas, you who take pleasure in riddles, solve for me the riddle that I saw. Interpret to me the vision of the most solitary man. For it was a vision and a premonition. What did I see in allegory? And who is it that must come one day? Who is the shepherd into whose mouth the snake thus crawled? Who is the man into whose throat all that is heaviest, blackest will thus crawl? The shepherd, however, bit as my cry had advised him. He bit with a good bite. He spat far away the snake's head and sprang up. No longer a shepherd, no longer a man, a transformed being surrounded by light, laughing. Never yet on earth had any man laughed as he laughed. Oh, my brothers, I heard a laughter that was no human laughter, and now a thirst consumed me, a longing that is never stilled. My longing for this laughter consumes me. Oh, how do I endure still to live, and how could I endure to die now? Thus spoke Zarathustra. So rounding off the section, then, we have such a horrific image of a snake having crawled into this poor shepherd's throat and is stuck in there with it held fast onto his throat, and Zarathustra tries to tug it off but can't. And then the shepherd bites the snake's head off and spits it out, and then stands up transformed, light beaming everywhere and laughing. And so we can say, well, it's quite a strange image in itself. But it sort of overlaps back into the first half to do with courage, to say, well, there's things that's going to hold us back. We've established that. There's also things that are going to make us go into this completely passive state where we're stuck in a state of self-doubt and pity for ourselves, and ultimately feeling sorry for ourselves in our given situation. And the whole point of Zarathustra's bite the head off the snake is ultimately to get us out of this self-wallowing and self-pity that we're into, become courageous, bite the head off the snake, spit it out, and therefore you overcome yourself. And of course, the other aspect of this whole biting the head off the snake might be perhaps referring to the idiom as to cut the head off a snake, for the quite famous saying as well. And what could that perhaps be in reference to is the way Nietzsche wants us to cut the head off our whole aspect of again, going back into part one here, where people expect life's journey to just be completely hunky-dory, no bumps in the road, and want to just continue about their lives from point A to point B without any problems. And Nietzsche's counter to that to say, well, what do we end up with is not only a very boring life, but it's also completely unrealistic, because things are going to happen whether we like them to happen or not. And so it's a completely wrong sort of attitude to have, because when things do happen and we don't expect it to happen, what can we do? And a very negative response to that is just wallow in self-pity instead of being courageous individual in order to overcome those events in our life. And so here we could also apply the whole idea to the sort of religious overtones as well of this section to say, well, if we had the whole niceness about the afterlife and so on, and that's all what life would be, is just this nice, blissful, peaceful state, like a nice Bob Ross painting, well, that's unrealistic. But also is to say, well, this whole aspect about us just wallowing in our own self-pity all the time and feeling sorry for ourselves is not helpful whatsoever. Because what are we as a human species? Courageous. We have conviction. We've got courage. We can overcome great things. That's what we need to ultimately champion as our values. A movie example for this section can be touched upon. A previous example that I've talked about is 127 Hours from 2010, starring James Franco, who plays Aaron Ralston, a mountain climber who gets trapped in a canyon and then soon takes desperate measures to survive and struggle for 127 hours before he's rescued. And the main climax about the whole film as well is that Aaron Ralston is there trapped in the rocks and his arms trapped. And in order to therefore get himself out, he has to therefore cut a part of his arm off to get out of the situation that he's in. So quite a harrowing and horrible situation. But again, it adds to the whole argument in the section that we could ultimately say, what can we do in that given situation is just wallow in our self-pity. But is it really going to help us in any given way? No. Why not? Because it's not going to get us out of that problem. What we need to do is ultimately find the courage, conviction, and willpower and strength to get out of it, even if that means therefore doing something as dramatic as having to cut off our own arm to get out of that situation. And really, it sort of builds upon that whole point as well of overcoming your own humanity within that given way. You overcome your own limitation because your own courage and conviction overcomes the body itself. And that therefore builds on quite a nice other example for this section is the film The Theory of Everything 2014, which is a biographical romance film about the life of Stephen Hawking. And Stephen Hawking was, of course, a theoretical physicist and also had motor neuron disease. And you have that in the film as well, where it plays out, where he's told he'll eventually be unable to walk, swallow, breathe, or move most of his body and would only have approximately 2 years to live. And it's the whole fantastic point as well of Stephen Hawking, not only in the film, but in real life as well, having that courage, conviction, and strength ultimately to prove the doctors wrong, but also the ability of just being able to continue to live his life despite having that condition. So overall then we have a section advocating and arguing for courage and therefore showing how we as a human species are courageous, have perseverance in the midst of adversity, and how all that is incredibly very positive for us as qualities and values to have. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section of the Vision and the Riddle in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Also, feel free to drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.